The first type of loop that we're going to talk about is the while loop. And the while loop consists of three parts. The first part is the while keyword itself. The second part is the conditions to be met in order to execute the third part, which is the code block. So we want to execute a particular code block denoted by this opening and closing curly brace while these conditions, or in this case this one condition, is true. And for this particular scenario, the condition that we care about is that our variable I has a numerical value less than the length of our par LMs array. And if it does, then for now we're just going to increment that variable I by 1. And something that's very important to remember about while loops and all loops is that eventually we want the condition, or at least one of the conditions, to be false so that we break out of our while loop. Otherwise, we're going to enter into what's called an infinite loop. So it's just going to continue repeating this code block forever and ever. One easy way to understand a scenario in which that might happen is if, for instance, our par LMs array had a length of at least 1, meaning that there was at least one paragraph element in our document, and we didn't increment this I variable. If we didn't increment this I variable, then what's going to happen is we're going to check the condition. I is 0, so yes, it's less than a length of at least 1, and then it does nothing. And then it checks again. I is still 0, which is still less than a length of at least 1, so it executes again, and it keeps repeating itself forever and ever. So it's very important that we put in place some code in our code block of the body of the while loop to make sure that eventually it's possible that we can break out of our loop. Now, this loop so far doesn't do anything all that interesting, but I'm going to add another bit of code in our while loops code block to do something more interesting. And that code is the switch statement from our previous section. But note something very important that I changed in this switch code. And that is that I changed the index from accessing the 0th element of our par LMs array to accessing the ith element of our par LMs array. And this is extremely powerful and an important concept to understand. If we wanted to iterate through each of our elements in our array and pass them through a switch statement without using a while loop, we would have to write switch statements for every single element in our array. And of course, one problem becomes, well, what if we don't know how many elements are in our array? So the while loop solves this problem by allowing us to address the general case where we have any arbitrary number of elements in our array, and it allows us to write a single switch statement by using a variable counter, in this case I, that iterates through each element of our array. That's pretty powerful, and that allows us to dramatically reduce the amount of code we need to write. Now, one final thing that I also want to address about this switch statement being nested inside of the while loop are those break statements for each of our cases. We recall from the previous section that when we break out of the parent code block. So in this case, our break statements are nested inside of our switch statement, which is nested inside of that while loop code block. So we're still just breaking out of the switch statement, but we'll continue to iterate through our while loop so long as that condition's met. However, if we want, we could also write a break statement to break out of the while loop code block. Therefore, we see that breaks are not unique to switch statements or while loops or any other type of code block. They're applicable to all code blocks in general. Now, let's verify that this while loop does what we think it ought to do by going first into our index.html and coming up with our hypothesis of what should happen. And in this case, we think what should happen is that we grab both these paragraph elements and our Chevy text gets styled as blue and our Toyota text gets styled as green. Let's go to the browser to make sure that this is the case. And indeed it is. Now, I would encourage you to really review while loops and make sure that you understand what's happening here in terms of the conditions and the looping and the iterating and making sure that eventually our conditions become false. Play around with that a little bit and become familiar with it. And once you are, we're going to move on to another type of loop called the for loop.